President, fellows and guests, it was in June 1882 that the remains of a Viking boat burial were discovered quite accidentally in the sand dunes at the head of Kiloran Bay on the Hebridean island of Colonsay. As a result, I quote, of curiosity being awakened by one or two clinker nails cast up at the mouth of a rabbit burrow. The finder was one Malcolm MacNeill, whose elder brother had been laird of Colonsay since 1877. Colonsay is one of the Inner Hebrides, a small island only 8 miles long, located between Mull to the north and Islay to the south, with Jura to the east. Colonsay, Mull, Islay and Jura. But as you can see, it is open to the western seaways. It is separated by a tidal strand from the even smaller island of Oronsay, well known for its Mesolithic middens and the ruins of a medieval priory. The Kiloran itself, as you can see, is located towards the northern end of Colonsay. The landscape of Colonsay is varied, with Kiloran Bay being just one of several fine beaches. It has a fertile interior, sufficiently sheltered to be unusually well wooded for a Hebridean island. In all respects, therefore, Colonsay and Oronsay would have provided the most inviting of prospects for those Vikings on the lookout for settlement opportunities in the 9th century. Indeed, there is a remarkable concentration of pagan Norse graves in Colonsay and Oronsay, but our concern today is with just one of them, the Viking boat burial found here at Kiloran Bay. This was excavated on 2 occasions in the 1880s, first by Malcolm MacNeill, as already noted, in 1882, and then a couple of years later by William Galloway. And it was he who delivered 2 papers on the subject to this society, which were, alas, never published. However, relics of both are happily preserved in the archives here, with some on display here this evening. Galloway described the location of the boat burial in a newspaper account written by him to publicise the display of the finds in Edinburgh in 1885, as follows. The scene of interment lies amid the wild, uncultivated sand dunes at the head of Kiloran Bay, between 200 and 300 yards from the existing beach. No indication remained of what lay beneath, curiosity being awakened by 1 or 2 clinker nails cast up at the mouth of a rabbit burrow. Rough ground, sand blown and blowing, sparsely covered with bent grass and thistles, alone met the eye. A rather more romantic than precise description of the fine place, I'm sure you will agree. But fortunately, somewhat more precise information was preserved in the MacNeill family, as it being at a location called Lag na Berlin, with its name derived from an incident which ended with the burning of the MacLean's Berlin, or barge. MacLean's from Mull, presumably. The site was marked by Symington Grieve on the archaeological map that forms the frontispiece to his 1923 book of Colonsay and Oronsay, towards the southern end of the bay, looking at this area here, at a location which is marked on the 1880 first edition of the Ordnance Survey, 6-inch map, as a substantial sand pit. This was just before the excavation, but here is the likely locality with a freshwater stream to one side. No first-hand account of Malcolm MacNeill's excavation is known to exist, but the measurements taken by him in 1882 form the basis for this plan and section, which was drawn up by William Galloway in the following year. He produced this for display, together with a selection of the grave goods, at the 1883 International Fisheries Exhibition held in London. I'll have to return to that in a moment. The following summer, that is in August 1884, Galloway himself made a further examination of the locality, as he described in the paper that he read here in 1885, of which a fair copy does still exist. Now, William Galloway lived from 1832 to 1897. He was a Scottish architect with a strong archaeological interests, best known for his restoration work on Whithorn Priory. What is known of his life and career as both architect and antiquary has been researched by our fellow Anna Ritchie, to whom I am most grateful for much assistance, but unfortunately she's unable to be here today. However, no image of him has been traced, so that's a challenge for any one of you here this evening. If you can come up with a picture of him, we would be most grateful. William Galloway spent some time in Colonsay and Oronsay in the 1870s, and then for more extended periods between 1881 and 1887. He appears to have stayed with the MacNeill family at Colonsay House, and certainly by June 1882, when he wrote to Sir Henry Dryden from Oronsay, he was the acknowledged antiquary there. His letter to Dryden states that the family have, on their own initiative, conferred on me the sole privilege of archaeological investigation, both on Colonsay and Oronsay, and printed notices to this effect have been hung up in the inn and other places. As a practical result of this arrangement, funds have been placed in my hands to make a commencement in clearing out the ruins of Oronsay Priory. In fact, Galloway had just excavated 3 short kists at Uragaig, located not far from Colonsay House, when he was assisted by 3 members of the MacNeill family. However, it appears that Galloway was away working at Oronsay Priory in that June, when Malcolm discovered the boat grave at Kiloran Bay. Although it seems most likely, as Anna Ritchie has suggested, that he would have seen the excavation, even if he had no part in it, and would certainly have discussed it with MacNeill. In any case, it was William Galloway who the following year, in May 1883, communicated here, and I quote from the proceedings, a paper on various remains from a Viking's grave and from 3 kists of the Neolithic period recently opened in the island of Colonsay. This paper will be published in the Archaeologia. However, Galloway appears never to have submitted his text for publication, although 3 watercolour drawings of grave goods from the find are preserved in the Society's archives and are here displayed. These, as you will soon see, are clearly signed Rosa Wallis Dell, 1883. Rosa Wallis was a young artist, the daughter of our fellow George Wallis, who was senior keeper of the art collection at South Kensington Museum. Her drawings provide a most valuable record of some of the finds brought to London by Galloway for display at the International Fisheries Exhibition, which opened in South Kensington in May 1883. Alas, no manuscript is known to have survived of Galloway's account of the Viking's grave, although there is a fair copy of the second part of his paper on the kist burials that is survived in the archives of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, because this is a part of a small group of papers concerning Galloway's discoveries in Colonsay and Oronsay that were given by his sister to Joseph Anderson, then the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, following Galloway's death in 1897, with the intention that Anderson might put them on record. The printed catalogue of the International Fisheries Exhibition contains little detail concerning the various relics from a Viking grave in Kiloran Bay, Colonsay, but its brief text was clearly abstracted from Galloway's own far more extensive catalogues raisonnés of the loan collection from Oronsay and Colonsay, which exists in this fair copy among the Galloway papers presented to Anderson. Given that it was written in 1883, it contains the earliest extant account of the original investigation of the boat burial. It has been transcribed by Anna Ritchie, the first part concerning a series of objects forming the result of various prehistoric shell mound explorations carried on by the exhibitor in the island of Oronsay, Western Hebrides, has already been published by Alan Saville, and the second part of it has been published by herself. So I shall only quote from the most relevant parts, illustrating it with the Rosa Wallis drawings. The grave in question the plan and section of which you've seen and was made for the exhibition, the grave in question, of which a plan and section are shown, was discovered quite accidentally in June 1882 by Malcolm McNeill, Esquire, blah, 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 and the following objects are exhibited. 1. A series of clinker nails or rivets, such as in Scandinavia are marked as the invariable accompaniments of a ship burial. You see them at the bottom of her picture. They were found strewn indiscriminately and at all depths through the body of sand filling the grave. 2. Another mount full of miscellaneous iron objects, including 2 knives corroded together. These, in fact, turn out to be a pair of arrowheads, although there are also knives in the grave. 3. An iron sword of the usual Norse pattern, subsequent to deposition in the grave, but while still uncorroded, it must have been subjected to a heavy superincumbent weight, while being at the same time held fast at the 2 extremities. The result is the curvature shown, the upturned point, and hilt set at an angle. Well, there's more to this than meets the eye. We'll come back to that. 4. Iron spearhead at the top. 5. Head of iron battle axe. And 6. Umbo or centre boss of shield, which has been covered with a strong textile fabric, all as illustrated. Bronze objects. Of these, by far the most important are the pair of scales, the beams and weights, etc. They were found, the scales one within the other, lying between the knees and the cranium of the skeleton, the front of the body. The second case contains portions of bronze belting and terminal plates, which have been riveted onto leather straps. Also a bronze pin, very perfect buckle, and 4 buttons, some of them with pieces of leather still adherent. In order to illustrate the find more completely, a few of the larger bones and a portion of the cranium of the Viking have been included, but not illustrated. I should add that the skeleton is in poor condition, but the bones are fairly robust and indicative of a male, the state of whose teeth suggests an age of over 40 years. On a visit to the Fisheries exhibition, the Reverend Joas of Gosby near Inverness made a rough copy of the McNeill-Galloway plan and section, and very rough, and sketched some of the finds, not altogether accurately. On returning to Scotland, he gave these drawings to his old friend Joseph Anderson, who subsequently used them, somewhat surprisingly given their poor quality, but he used them to illustrate his eventual publication of the boat grave in 1907. Now we too must return to Scotland, back to Colonsay and Kiloran Bay itself. Visits to the eroding site following the 1882 excavation resulted in 3 small coins being found in the form of copper alloy stikers or Northumbrian pennies, all, according to Galloway, found within the area enclosed but on the surface as the sand dried and blew away, and chiefly by Mr. Duncan McNeill, son of Malcolm McNeill, during his occasional holiday visits to the island. In June 1885, Galloway wrote to Dryden that Knight Watson of the Antiquaries London already has the account of the Colonsay find, and it will be read at their last meeting on the 25th next. Indeed, a second paper by Galloway was then read to the Society, although he was unable to do it in person. It had the title that you see here. And then, according to the minutes of the meeting, this time also it said, this account of the horse interment will be published in the Archaeologia. Although nothing about Kiloran Bay was ever published by Galloway in Archaeologia, the Society possesses 4 ink and watercolour drawings that were presumably used to illustrate his second paper, for he signed and dated them June 1885. These consist of this plan here, showing, we can see it on the screen as well, this plan here, showing the horse that he uncovered. And I'm most pleased to see that we can have it here once again on display in the meeting room, well over a century after its first appearance. Galloway also provided a full-size depiction of the lower part of the right hind limb of the horse, showing wounds received while still in life, and 2 also full-size drawings of cross-graven schist slabs, but these are not really in good enough condition to bring down today. As previously mentioned, a fair copy of Galloway's paper is preserved amongst those given to Anderson after his death. As a primary source for the Kiloran Bay boat burial, I intend to publish it in full, but for now just some select quotations. It always having been, he says, it always having been my intention to make a further examination of the locality, I took the opportunity of doing so while on a visit to Colonsay House in August last. I found the place quite undisturbed since the previous explorations. A heap of schist stones strewn over where the workings had been alone met the eye. Lying towards the west end of this heap, I found the cross-graven slab to be afterwards noticed. With spade and small pick, I searched the sand, but only found a few clinker nails and fragments of human bones, until, going outside the area previously examined, and immediately to the east of where the line of enclosure on that side must have been, I came accidentally on part of the limb bone of a large mammal. Following up this clue, I gradually uncovered the entire skeleton of a horse lying on its right side. A horse about 15 hands high and from 15 to 20 years of age. It has evidently been a fine-bred animal. Well, here it is. Archaeologically, the most interesting part, as he went on to say, archaeologically, the most interesting part of the skeleton is the right hind limb, indicating as it does the probable manner in which the animal was slain, either in battle or otherwise. On putting the fragments together, a singular pathological study presented itself. It was evident that by means either of a sword, battle axe, or other sharp, lethal weapon, the animal had been struck a terrific blow on the right hind limb, which must have disabled the animal and may most probably have been received in battle, in which the rider also may have fallen. Hence his full-size illustration of it. Here I need to interpolate that modern opinion is that the horse was aged a more reasonable 6 to 8 years, with a height of about 14.2 hands, and would have died from having had its throat cut or from being stabbed to death, given that there are no traces of lethal wounds on the skeleton, although perhaps after being immobilized by having its right hamstring cut. Galloway's account of his excavation then continues. It may be mentioned that a layer of mould lay amid the sand between the remains and the surface. One of the most noteworthy features of the discovery was the large number of clinker nails or rivets and other iron objects, both in and around the remains as found. They seem to have permeated the skeleton in every way, and with the undisturbed state of the remains found now and previously, suggests the idea that the ship may have been capsized over them, the clinker nails having fallen down as her timbers gradually decayed. Had the Norseman, his horse, arms and other grave goods, been deposited within the ship, set upon an even keel, as in several recorded instances in Scandinavia, it seems impossible for them, or the decay of the wooden structure by which they would in that case have been supported, to have subsided in the absolutely undisturbed manner in which they were found. Apart from these reliquials, spared to us by time, we can only surmise the aspect this grave must have presented long centuries ago. A lofty howe or mound there must have been enclosing a stout ship, and many things to us most interesting had their preservation been possible. But all the more patent and more perishable evidences of the ancient sea king's interment have long since disappeared, while the storms of 1,000 winters have been singing their requiem over his lonely and undated grave. You may not be surprised to learn that Galloway was described in one of his obituaries as a poet of some eminence, although apparently only one poem by him is now known. Galloway's report continues with a section on the 2 cross-graven slabs and concludes with a description of the Anglo-Saxon Stikers. It was the cross slabs that, not surprisingly, gave rise to considerable speculation on his part. And you see one is marked as lying at this end outside the enclosure, and one is marked as having been here also outside the actual enclosure. You see them here not in his drawing, but in a modern drawing. He speculated about them. As already mentioned, among the rough schist slabs strewn over the surface of the ground, which had previously formed part of the enclosure, he thinks, lying at the west end, I found one with a Latin cross of the simplest and most primitive form. Like the others, it is quite undressed and rough as it came from the hillside. The second slab I found at the east end of the enclosure. It had not been previously disturbed, but lay buried amongst the sand, which had to be cleared away in order to uncover the skeleton of the horse. There can be no doubt of the high antiquity of these symbols, or that they are in all probability coeval with the interment, the only difficulty being to account for their presence under such peculiar circumstances. All the indications go to prove that the interment belongs to the Norse pagan period. The attitude of the body was precisely that so familiar to us in the short-kissed pagan interments, crouched, and the orientation directly the reverse of that practiced under Christianity. The mere fact of the man being so interred with all his grave goods and belongings shows an unbroken belief in the pagan ideas of the afterworld and the place the Norsemen of that era expected to occupy in it. There have also been found in this grave 3 Anglo-Saxon Stikers, and so within the latter half of the 9th century, or not very long after that, the burial may have reasonably been reckoned, while over a century had yet to relapse ere Norse Christianization had even begun. At the same time, it must not be forgotten that on the site now occupied by Colonsay House, there stood the earliest and most noted ecclesiastical establishment in the island, only a mile distant from, and fully within sight of, the scene of the interment. May it not then be entertained as a reasonable supposition that these cross-graven slabs, so rude and primitive, yet evidently so genuine in their character, were in their erection due to the pious care of the Coenobites of Kiloran. One thing is clear, that while there can be no doubt as to the authenticity of the 2 sets of evidence, they clearly contravene each other. Yet they come before us not as we might have expected in an attitude of antagonism, but to all appearance, and so far as we can judge, of decided amity. There cannot be a shadow of doubt as to the authenticity of the facts, nor do I think that there can be any as to their contemporaneous character. And the occurrence of these cross-graven slabs under circumstances so peculiar seems to me one of the most singular features in this interment, as it still does today. And he ends with a note about the Anglo-Saxon Stikers. These coins, which are as yet only 3 in number, were not found in the ordinary course of exploration, unless indeed the sand had been sifted, a troublesome process owing to its partial dampness. From their small size, they could scarcely have been found. They have been found entirely within the area enclosed, but on the surface, as the sand dried and blew away. And on being consigned to my care, I forwarded them to Reginald Stewart Poole of the Department of Coins and Medals, British Museum. Poole declared one of them to be illegible, and it has for long been missing. But the 2 extant Stikers, both pierced, are today identified as one issued by Archbishop Wigmund, 837-54, with the other being from Ethelred II's first reign, dating from 841 to 844. Let us now turn to the subsequent biography of the find from the 1880s to the 1990s. As explained by Anna Ritchie, it is around this time, in the early 1880s, that William Galloway appears to have fallen out with Joseph Anderson, perhaps over the artefacts from the Oronsay shell mines and or those from the Kiloran Bay ship burial. After the flurry of his contributions in the 1870s, Galloway took no more part in the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland's meetings or publications after 1880. And instead of giving the Antiquaries Museum the finds from his excavations, either he retained them in his own collection, or in the case of the Viking artefacts from Colonsay, he loaned them to the Museum of Science and Art, which later became the Royal Scottish Museum. The loan is dated to February 1885, and the list of objects includes a box in Scotch walnut containing bronze objects found in the above grave. Galloway publicised this loan, which he acknowledged was made with the kind permission of Sir John McNeill, VC, KCB, KCMG, in a newspaper article in which he specifically mentions this box in Scotch walnut so as to enhance the importance of its contents for the public, writing, I quote, that all the bronze objects have been arranged in an elegant case and are exhibited as shown to Her Majesty at Balmoral in November last. And one can only suppose that Sir John McNeill must have been in attendance at the court and have taken them along for her edification and entertainment. In March 1885, Galloway wrote that my Viking horse and things are now on view, my horse and things are now on view in the museum in Chambers Street, where they were displayed in 2 large cases that had been made especially for them. The skeleton of the horse was placed in the one and the Viking and his belongings in the other, as Galloway described in a letter to A.W. Franks at the British Museum in December 1886. Galloway was writing to offer the loan of the Kiloran Bay material to the British Museum, with McNeill's permission. But Franks wrote back declining. He said, for want of space, or perhaps, as Anna Ritchie has speculated, because he was unwilling to become involved in robbing another museum of part of its current displays. After this failure to have the finds moved to the British Museum, they remained at the Royal Scottish until 1924, when they were transferred on loan, apart from the horse, to the National Museum of Antiquities in Queen Street, but together with 3 other artefacts also from Colonsay. They were thus there just in time to be studied by the visiting Norwegian archaeologist Sigurd Grieg in 1925. But unfortunately, he was led to believe that all the objects were associated, thereby creating considerable confusion, which has only recently been fully unscrambled. Grieg's inventory was first published in 1930, in summary form by his fellow Norwegian archaeologist A.W. Brøger, accompanied by the earliest known photographs of the finds, which includes at the bottom there a lump of stone, which Grieg catalogued as a fragment of small whetstone of a grey rock, pointed at one extremity, rounded at the other, somewhat worn. Galloway makes no reference to a whetstone having been found in the burial, or to any other stone artefact except for the 2 cross-incised slabs, and there is no evidence at all with which to support this attribution. Indeed, it has since been identified as a Mesolithic stone tool, and is in any way now lost. Brøger's photograph of pins and harness mounts includes a bronze ringed pin at the very top, now also known not to be from the burial, although it likewise formed part of this loan from the RSM, together with this small conical boss that you see at the bottom of the slide, illustrated together with the ornamented lead weights from Kiloran Bay. This pin and this mount should never have been associated with the boat grave, and indeed it has recently proved possible to reprovenance them to another Colonsay grave, Viking grave, given the discovery of this illustrated letter from Galloway to Dryden, in which he describes their discovery at a different location, identified by Anna Ritchie as being in the area of Mackrins Bay. In 1979, the RSM's loan to the National Museum was converted into a donation, and during the 1980s and 1990s, more detailed research was undertaken on the grave goods in preparation for the opening of the new Museum of Scotland, as part of which we commissioned this, I have to say, really rather inaccurate reconstruction drawing, and it really shouldn't be seen in public. But it has been published, so here it is. A joint publication was planned by Trevor Cowie, Kate Gordon and myself, and even announced as forthcoming. However, this work in progress came to be subsumed into the Pagan Norse Graves of Scotland project, which Caroline Patterson and myself are currently engaged in bringing to completion with assistance from Stephen Harrison. But in the meantime, I'm happy to say the Scandinavian maritime archaeologist Jan Biel has published an important paper on the nature of the Kiloran Bay boat burial based on his specialist study of the nails and rivets. Anyway, for the opening of the Museum of Scotland in 1998, the finds from the Kiloran Bay boat burial were reunited with the horse skeleton and placed on display in the Early People's Gallery. that is until recently, when a leaky roof has meant that the relevant cases have had to be emptied for the foreseeable future. It took a long time for anything to appear about the burial in print. And it was in October 1906 that the well-known Norwegian archaeologist Håkon Shetelig visited Edinburgh, fresh from the excavations of the famous Oseberg ship burial in Norway. When in Edinburgh, he saw the finds from Kiloran Bay, together with the plan, and he immediately wrote a brief account for publication in the Saga book, as an addendum to his paper on Viking ship burials that he had read the previous winter to the Viking Society in London. It was surely no coincidence that in the following year, Joseph Anderson read to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland what he called an abstract concerning the Viking grave mound at Kiloran Bay, derived from Galloway's unpublished notes. Now, given that Anderson had been sitting on Galloway's papers since 1899, it seems only reasonable to suppose that this sudden flurry of activity was occasioned by his knowledge of Shetelig's imminent publication in the Saga book, from which he was then to quote at some length in his published version. It's strange but true that Anderson's account was not based on personal examination of the finds, although they were just up the road, but rather on the sketches done by Joas at the Fisheries exhibition. You remember. For example, Anderson would not otherwise have wrongly described the balance beam as having an ornamented trefoil on top. You see, Joas drew it like this. And the pin as having a small globular head. He drew the pin like this. But if we look at Rosa Wallace's drawings, as we see here, you can see, for instance, that the pin has got a perforated head and the top of the balance is completely plain. There are 130 extant iron rivets and nails from Kiloran Bay. You see a few of them on Broger's photograph. Some of these have mineralised wood attached, which has been identified as oak. And Jan Bill's analysis has led him to conclude that it is very likely that there was a complete boat in the grave with a maximum length of 12 metres, a boat that was standing on its keel, although he regarded it as, I quote, not completely clear whether this boat contained the burial, as is normal, or whether it was placed above it, a subject to which I shall return at the end. As Shetelig pointed out, one of the respects in which the Kiloran Bay boat burial differs from a regular Norwegian grave from the Viking Age is that it was provided with an enclosure of slabs set on edge. He later commented that such was to be regarded as a local fashion confined to the Viking settlements in Scotland, with another point of difference being the fact that two of the slabs forming the enclosure were marked with a cross. According to Galloway, the rectangular enclosure was formed as slabs, rough slabs, and the plan and depiction section depicts some of the stones protruding above the then ground surface, on which others are shown lying on what is presumably an erosion slope. As Jan Bill has observed, the enclosure is too large to have been constructed within a boat of the calculated size, and so if the burial were to have been a conventional boat grave, then it must have been wrongly perceived or reconstructed by Galloway, unless, of course, the boat had formed a covering. As you can see, the plan is captioned, the stones much displaced, undermined by rabbits and probably disturbed by searchers for treasure, side stones fallen inwards and outwards, covering stones are also fallen. 4 rabbit holes were sufficiently prominent to be marked as such on the plan, but Galloway must have done some tidying up of the side stones fallen inwards and outwards, given that they are all shown in vertical positions. Indeed, Jan Bill, commenting on it, I quote, "The captivating regularity of the excavation plans suggests to him that MacNeill may have failed to observe correctly, or Galloway to record accurately, a different form of construction, in which perhaps the flagstones had been on the outside of the boat, and the inner ones had been erected to form a chamber within it." On this basis, Jan Bill concluded that the conventional boat grave theory provided a more likely explanation than that of a chamber grave below a boat. However, his theory does not take account of the fact that neither McNeill nor Galloway observed any in situ rows of rivets, rather the opposite, nor does he explain how the vertical slabs at either end would have been supported if serving as internal dividers within a boat. The east end of the enclosure had evidently collapsed in the interval between McNeill's first excavation and Galloway commencing his own, because it was on extending the excavation, you remember, that it was immediately to the east that he encountered one of the cross-incised slabs on his way to uncovering the skeleton of the horse. I think that the evidence of Galloway's plan, the second plan, I think that the evidence of Galloway's plan suggests that neither of these two cross slabs ever formed an integral part of the actual enclosure, but had been set up separately at either end. However, as has been observed by Marilyn Brown, these crosses are far from prominent, and as a statement of belief, they would have had an extremely muted impact. You see, they're scratched and not really carved at all. A significant difference between the two grave plans is the position of the spearhead, discovered in 1882. It is marked only on the second plan, located towards the west end, you see here, so that if its shaft, if intact, would have divided the interior of the chamber longitudinally into two parts, with that on the south side containing the crouched male burial and the most of the grave goods. On the original plan, the other weapons are shown as likewise placed along the back side of the body, the sword, shield and axe. In front of the body had been placed the scales and weights, as were with at the feet the remains of an iron pot. We think maybe there were two such pots in the grave. The only grave goods recorded as having been found in the northern part of the divided enclosure are the remains of bronze belting, etc., placed towards the east end, up here, not far from a small group of human remains. These have inevitably given rise to speculation as to this having been a double burial, although there is no evidence amongst the surviving skeletal material for there having been more than one body. But then the bones are in extremely poor condition, with the smaller bones having entirely decayed. So we can't rule out the fact that there may have been two separate interments. The case for there having been a second body within the enclosure is perhaps strengthened by the suggestion that it was divided by the spear, with the explanation for the placement of fine horse harness so far from the principal grave goods of the Viking, then being that they were buried alongside the individual responsible for the animal sacrificed for the occasion. By way of comparison, there are probably two different corpses in the boat at Balladool, Isle of Man, a male to whom apparently the grave goods belonged, and possibly an unaccompanied female. Brown went on to speculate that the cross-incised slabs may relate to the probable second burial in the enclosure, with the need to identify or protect a Christian included in an otherwise overtly pagan grave. Although I suppose they might alternatively have been erected by a Christian relation of the man being commemorated, required to participate in the pagan ceremony with its postulated human sacrifice. Galloway concluded himself that had the Norseman, his horse, arms and other grave goods been deposed within a ship set upon an even keel, it seems impossible for them, on the decay of the wooden structure by which they would in that case have been supported, to have subsided in the absolutely undisturbed manner in which they were found. Galloway's logic is not entirely clear, but it is certainly the case that the gradual decay of a boat immediately above the burial, with the weight of sand from a covering mound, could account for the disposition of the rivets as found, after a good many of them had been disturbed by the burrowing rabbits. It is, however, doubtful that Galloway was correct in supposing that the vessel had been capsized over it. But the manner in which the boat was placed over the burial enclosure must remain a matter of debate. But we can see how Galloway's suggestion that the ship may have been capsized over became a fact following Anderson's categorical statement that the boat had been overturned so as to form a cover over the grave, with Shetlig then describing Kiloran Bay as a typical exponent of this custom, citing the well-known 9th century boat grave at Hedeby in Viking Age Denmark as the most splendid example of this mode of burial. You may be familiar with some of you. However, the practice of using a boat as a grave cover is rare, rather than as a ready-made burial chamber, because that's how we know it elsewhere in Scotland, including Westness and Scar in Orkney. But this alternative theory that the boat was standing over the grave is, even if an unproven theory, is the one currently preferred by me, because I put greater trust on the observations and records made by McNeill and Galloway during their site investigations than did Jan Biel. Of the actual mound itself, we can say very little, though Galloway's observation of there having been a layer of mould in the sand suggests the presence of turds in its makeup, as can be seen in other finds. So these vestigial traces of the mine serve as a reminder, as indeed does this imaginative reconstruction of the Hedeby burial procession, a reminder that there are many aspects of the funeral and construction of the boat grave that inevitably elude us, as Galloway himself was the first to appreciate. You remember, there must have been many things to us most interesting had their preservation been possible, but all the more patent and more perishable evidences of the ancient sea king's interment have long since disappeared. A final word about dating, and then I shall bring to a close. Writing in 1907, Shetlig commented that the most precious document for determining the date of the grave is afforded by the 2 coins found. And he said that the grave is most likely to date from the beginning of the 10th century. At the same time, Anderson took the coins as an indication that the grave should not date any earlier than the close of the first half of the 9th century. So we have a date suggested by these 2 eminent figures between the mid-9th and the early 10th century. Shetlig's identification of the sword as being a Peterson type K with a distinctive 5-lobed pommel has been confirmed by X-ray, and these are generally known to have been deposited during the second half of the 9th century. This is a period that encompasses both the Dublin type spearhead, that is a non-Scandinavian type, and also the shield boss, which is also of non-Scandinavian type, but of Harrison's Irish Sea type. Both of these he would also place in the second half of the 9th century. Indeed, none of the artefacts need to be dated to the 10th century, by which time the balance would certainly have had an old-fashioned appearance. A neck bone from the horse was radiocarbon dated, but this added little to the chronological debate other than to confirm its Viking Age date. So more recently a human bone has been dated, and this gave a calibrated date range of 695 to 939 at 95.4% probability. The 2 dates have been combined for us by Rick Schulting, and the resulting date for the burial is Cal AD 771 to 953 at 95.4% probability, a range that can in fact be considerably reduced at the early end on numismatic grounds. Although the authors of the checklist of coin hoards proposed the 840s as an approximate date for the deposition of the Kiloran Bay coins, it must be remembered that they have all been demonetarized by being pierced, and thus provide only a rather distant terminus postquem for the burial, a factor that will have influenced Michael Dolly's suggested deposition date of circa 870. Recent study of coins mounted on lead weights, as will most probably have been the case with these perforated Stikers, has suggested to Gareth Williams that the ornamented weights of the type found at Kiloran Bay, you see the whole set here, were only introduced in the 860s and 870s, or maybe the 3rd quarter of the 9th century. So by way of conclusion, the combined chronological evidence of the grave goods suggests that the Kiloran Bay boat burial took place during the second half of the 9th century, with Dolly's proposal that the Stikers were deposited circa 870, providing a most reasonable date for the ancient sea king's interment. a date fully compatible with the combined calibrated radiocarbon date, although this does of course allow for a somewhat later date for the burial, even if the artefactual evidence suggests me otherwise. I appreciate that by having concentrated on William Galloway's role in the discovery and subsequent history of the Kiloran Bay boat burial, I've had to admit much of potential interest concerning the actual grave goods, although I can endeavour to answer any questions about them in the small amount of time that I've left for discussion. There is indeed so much more that could be said of our ancient sea king and of the roles that the deceased might have played in his life, and indeed in his funeral rites, as a likely first-generation Viking settler, as an equestrian warrior chief and or seafaring trader, a man of as yet unknown origin, but whose connections certainly stretched from Norway to Dublin, and a man who was buried in a pagan manner in a Christian island. Despite all our best efforts, and it is a team project, there is much that can never now be known. But the fact that we do have so much to ponder upon is most certainly a tribute to William Galloway for the care with which he carried out his antiquarian endeavours, even if he failed in his duty of publication. But I invite you afterwards to inspect some of his legacy, and with that, I thank you.